Guten Tag, ich bin Matt Brooker, Trading as Disraeli, und das ist ein Sondersvideoclip für 2000 AD Covers Uncovered. Previously on 2000 AD Prog 1835 Stickleback cover, design, composition, drawing, masking, textures, and greys. Yes, it's been a positive whirl of soporific technobabble so far, but prepared for your indifference to soar to new heights as we reach the concluding stages of 2000 AD Prog 1835 Stickleback cover. Now, before we start the painting, I want to darken down some of the areas of texture and give us some good black for the painting to stand out against. But I want that black only to appear where the texture is, so I'm going to use the texture itself as a mask. The textures are sitting on their own layer, so if I use Select, Load Selection, Layer Transparency, I can instantly select everything on that layer in one go. Now that I've got my selection, I'm going to go up to another layer above the textures, and I'm going to fill that selection with white on the new layer. I know that seems a bit odd, but bear with me, because what I'm going to do next is change the layer transparency to multiply, which makes the white completely transparent, effectively invisible. And the next stage after that is going to be to lock transparency so that I'm only going to be able to paint on those invisible pixels. And this is a way of constraining my painting to the area I want without having to have a selection live, which I can either switch off, or you get that kind of dancing around the edges of the selection area, and it's generally a bit distracting and difficult to see. So you can see now I'm using a big wide Photoshop brush loaded with black just to darken down selective areas and make different parts of the drawing stand out one against another. In a second you'll see I'm using a selection on the end of the tree roots there just to make them stand forward of Bob, and really all this is about clarity. It's trying to make sure that different parts of the image move forward or push back so you can see what you're meant to be looking at. And once we've got this stage done, then we're ready to take the image into Corel Painter and do the final stages, really, of painting and detailing. I've opened the file now in Corel Painter. Painter can deal with Photoshop files, so there's no need for any kind of special export or anything. What I'll usually do with Painter, though, is to save the file out in Painter's own native RIF format while I'm working on it, because otherwise the saves for Photoshop files in Painter are just incredibly long. And I also reduce the number of layers in the file because Painter's quite memory hungry, and otherwise it'll slow the program down quite a bit. You can see here that I've combined all the shading and texture layers so that I can switch them on and off in one go to get at the masks at the bottom of the file. And once again, I'll be using the same process where I make selections from the color blocks at the bottom of the file and then move up onto painting layers and paint into the selections. I've got a bit of a love-hate relationship with Corel Painter, and here's one of the reasons why. You'll see I'm having to uncheck anti-alias and contiguous on the Magic Wand tool. I don't generally use either of those settings, but the interface resets itself every time you restart the program, and every time you have to set it back. I'm going to take a selection from the bottom layer. I don't bother uncovering the masks because I can see roughly where they're going to be. And then I take a digital watercolor brush loaded with black, and I'm starting to add just little bits of shading and feathering to some of the dark areas to soften them up a bit. This brush that I'm using is one that I've modified to work with Wacom's airbrush stylus. The tool in its basic form is pressure sensitive, so the harder you press on, the darker the color you get. The modified one responds to the control wheel on the airbrush stylus, and so I can get a wider or thinner line, which saves me having to change brushes. I'm a big fan of the Wacom airbrush, and if you'd like to know more about the advantages of using one, I did a really long blog post giving all the details about it. That can be found in the sidebar of my blog, which is logically enough called The Blog of Israeli. So let's just speed the action up a little bit and you can see me finish off the rest of this section. And all I'm really doing here is just softening certain of the edges and generally giving it a slightly more organic painted look rather than something that's just been pulled together and is a kind of hard mechanical collage. So this is the image now with the painting stage finished, and it's all just been tightened up a little bit, and we've just kind of added the final details, like for example the striping on Stickleback's trousers and so on. So the next step is to take this out into Photoshop and to add the very last stages before sending it on to 2000 AD. Now remember, this is a native Painter RIF file which Photoshop can't read, so we're going to have to convert it into something else in order to put it into Photoshop. I could save it as a Photoshop file from Painter. Painter will let you do that, but that would leave me with yet another version of the same file, takes up space on the hard disk and so on. So instead I'm going to use Painter's clone function, which is the same as duplicate in Photoshop, and that will create a flat copy with no layers that I'll save as a TIFF and then open up in Photoshop and add as a layer to the Photoshop file I'm already working on. Here we are back in Photoshop with two files open, the TIFF file that I saved from Painter and the original Photoshop file which hasn't got any of the new work in it, all the stuff that was done subsequently. So back to the TIFF file, select all and copy that, close it then because we don't need it anymore, and paste that TIFF file into the Photoshop document. And that is exactly the same size as the Photoshop document, so it will all fit and align perfectly. Just before we finish off, I want to add a few what I call glows or bits of misting, just basically to pull those foreground dinosaurs forward a little bit and show that stuff in the image is on different planes. So I'm going to hide everything except the background layer and then just use the Magic Wand tool to separate out the parts of the image that I want. I'm going to put a glow in behind the muzzle flash where Stickleback's shooting the dinosaur, so I need to mask Stickleback and the dinosaur out. It's quite a complicated selection with lots of areas of colour, but there's a quick way of doing it. I use the Magic Wand tool with contiguous turn to off. It will grab every instance of a particular colour across the whole frame. You can see here as I'm using Quick Mask to check what I've got, that I've got all these chunks of colour, some of which I don't want. So I'm going to use the lasso tool while still in Quick Mask mode, draw around the stuff that I don't want, and delete it. And depending on how your colour blocks overlap with each other, this can be an awful lot faster than just pecking away at individual areas using the Magic Wand tool with contiguous activated. Now, you might spot the deliberate mistake. What I've now got selected are all the things that I want masked out, but that's easily dealt with. I just use invert selection, which is in the selection menu, or it's Command or Control plus I. So I'm going to add the glow, and first I'm going to use a circular gradient just to establish the basic brightening, and then I'm going to use a texture brush which has got a captured spatter pattern just to kind of make that a bit more gritty and organic looking. And there you can see already that the head of the dinosaur is really kind of popped forward against all those background characters now because the glow has made a bright background against the dark shadows of its head. And that's kind of what gives you points of emphasis in a drawing, is areas of either dark against bright or bright against dark. Using the same technique, I'm here masking out the two foreground dinosaurs and again just putting a little bit of white misting between them and everything that's meant to be behind them. And I'm keeping this fairly subtle, but I'm just trying to establish that there's a bit of distance between the characters and create a little bit of depth in the picture. So one of the difficult things about doing any sort of drawing is actually deciding when it's finished. And here I had a little think about the kind of silhouettes of the dinosaurs in the background and whether they would be better, lighter or darker. So in a second you'll see me playing around with adding and removing masks to see how that looks with the dinosaurs sort of darker or lighter or little bits of them faded out and so on. And the great thing about digital is it lets you play around with stuff like that without making any kind of final decisions. And at the very last moment, I had a think and decided to do an alternate version of the cover with a black background to it. And when I submitted these to Matt Smith, I submitted both of them, and he actually picked the black one, and that's what became the final cover. Okay, well, if anybody out there's still awake, thank you for watching. I hope that you found something in these videos that's been interesting or useful to you, or hopefully both. Goodbye for now. I was Matt Brooker, trading as Disraeli, and this has been a special video for 2000 AD Covers Uncovered, 2000 AD Covers blogspot.com.